Good morning. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, and your objective for today is I will complete a guided reading worksheet so that I can demonstrate my knowledge of the workers in the North. You're actually going to do this today and tomorrow. So the worksheet that I put up yesterday called Guided Reading, Chapter 14, Section 2, is actually for both Thursday and Friday. So if you finish it today, you're done for the weekend. But that's up to you. Let me review very quickly what you should have learned from yesterday. First off, there were some problems. We had all this progress. We had new technology. But anytime there's new technology and progress, there's going to have issues with it. There's going to be accidents. There's going to be things that we didn't think in advance about because we didn't have that technology. So the two that they talked about yesterday was the SS Central America, and it was a new steamship that went down to Panama Canal, went down to the Panama, and it ended up going into a hurricane. Because remember, they didn't have the same technology we have today. So they had no idea there was a hurricane coming, and they went into a hurricane, and it sank, and a lot of people were killed. Then there was the Great Train Wreck of 1856, and basically two trains were on the same track. Today with technology, that doesn't happen because we have computers that say, hey, there's already a train on that track, and they move tracks. But at that time, it was all done manually by people, and they didn't know that they were both on the same track going the same way, and they collided, killing quite a few people and injuring 160 people were killed and 100 people were injured. So that was a huge tragedy at that time. Okay, now, they also had communications, was a new technology. A guy named Samuel Morse came up with this idea of a Morse code. It was the predecessor to telephone wires today. Basically, there would be a wire, and one person would click on a little machine, and it's called a dot and a dash. So a dot would be ding, and then a dash would be ding. And when you did them in a certain order, they made letters, which then translated into words. So the one person would do it from the one side, the other person would listen and write down the letters, and then transcribe what was being sent over, and then they would tell the person who was receiving the message. Okay, and that was called Morse code. And that was the telegraph. In farming innovations, many people had been moving out west. Remember, when we were talking west, we were talking like Midwest. People going over the Appalachian Mountains. And when they got to Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, beautiful land, beautiful farmland. But as more and more people started going west, they started pushing further and further west. And we know about the Oregon Trail and people going out to the Pacific coast. But there was land in between there, what we call the prairies. And a lot of the there was a prairie as opposed to a forest. And it's smaller. It's like a big trees, like a forest. It's smaller plants. And they had the soil on top was pretty hard. They called it, they'd call it sod clodding, and it was where they would have to break up this hard soil on top. And so with the regular farm implements, they weren't working very well. But John Deere came up with the steel-tipped plow. And at this time, the plow was either hand where you pushed it and you broke up the dirt so you could put the seeds in, or you would use a horse or an oxen or a mule to pull it. But they were made of wood. So John Deere, which we know John Deere tractors today, came up with the idea that you put steel tip on it because the steel tip would go through the hard sod, and you'd be able to get to the dirt that way. He made a lot of money, and as we know, his company is still around today. Another guy named Cyrus McCormick came up with a mechanical reaper. And prior to this, before the reaper that he made, you literally had a scythe, and it was like a big machete, but it was long, and it kind of had a semicircle, and you would walk through the wheat, and you'd have to go back and forth with your arm and cut down the wheat. Very time consuming. But with the mechanical reaper, you could just walk through, and it would flip through, and it would take care of the wheat very quickly, which meant that the farmers out on the prairie could actually produce more wheat because they could get it in time. So that's what we learned yesterday. Okay, today you're learning about the people in the north, and tomorrow, because remember the guided reading I gave you is for both days. So I'm going to go ahead and just go through all of it today, because there's no reason to have another video tomorrow. So the factories in the north. Okay, this is interesting. The workers that worked in the factories, a lot of them were immigrants, and they were poor people. And no one really cared about them. And so the southern people said, hey, our slaves, at least they're taken care of. They have medical, we feed them, they don't go hungry. Your factory workers have it worse, because when they get hurt, they're just out of a job, and they're not going to be able to feed themselves or their families. They get hurt all the time. You don't care about them. You don't pay them enough wages to actually feed themselves. And pretty much these were all true, but at least they were free. The factory workers, they were working 11.4 hours, so they're working almost half their day away. They worked 6 days a week. It was cold in the winter. They didn't have heat, so they would freeze all winter. And in the summer, machines give off heat when they're moving. You know that from science class. And in the summer, it might be 90 degrees in there, outside and in there, and then add the heat. So you're talking over 100 degrees. And these people were working, over 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when you get fatigued, when you get tired, your brain starts to cloud over. You know that because we do it at school all the time. You take little mental breaks. Well, if you take a mental break at school, you just kind of sit there and stare out into space, and the teacher goes, hey, come back to Earth, But when you're a factory worker and you have belts and all these things going on and levers and things moving, if you take a mental break and you make a mistake, it could cost you an arm, a leg, or your life. And so many of the workers did get hurt. And remember, at this time, we've talked about this, there was child labor. And they would get the little kids, people would bring their whole families. And these little kids would be sent in to do things that were not safe. So men, women, and children were being injured and killed. Now, some of the workers decided they wanted to organize. They wanted to get together and discuss and get better working conditions. And they started trade unions. The original trade unions were skilled workers, people who did a specific job and were trained to do so. That wasn't just the people that were throwing things on the assembly line type thing. It was people who were actually skilled. And they were the first ones. And they did go on strike, but we all know that that didn't work out really great. Most of them lost their jobs. They just got rid of them because there were so many other new people coming in. We had so many immigrants. Now, African Americans, the African Americans living in the South, most were slaves. And they were treated very poorly and very harshly. They were beat. They could be sold. But if you were a freed African American living up north, there was still prejudice. Or if you were an escaped slave that went up north, there was still prejudice. The people didn't like them either. So it wasn't like we talked about the abolitionists. It wasn't like the white Americans up in north were going, yay, free the slaves. So there was a lot of prejudice. And most of the towns and communities and states, they weren't going to let African Americans vote or have rights. So there was a lot of prejudice, and it was bad for the African Americans up there too. A few African Americans did do well. We already heard about Macon B. Allen. He was the first one to go to law school and become a lawyer. And you might remember Samuel Cornell and John B. Resmurth from last chapter, chapter 15. They actually founded their own newspaper called the Freedom Journal, but that wasn't the norm. Most African Americans treated up north were treated very poorly. Okay, at this time in the 1800s, we had mass immigration. Literally, when we talk about the Statue of Liberty, give us give us everyone, bring them here. Well, that was true. And at this time, we had cities, that were getting bigger. A lot of the cities, as we know, were on waterways down the Mississippi River or tributaries into the Mississippi River. If you could get to a city or a town by boat, it was a lot easier to get things in and out, so they became transportation hubs. And some of these that really came together at this time were St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, and it's all because of their situation on waterways. Immigration, millions of people were coming here. And one of the reasons that a lot of Irish people came here was the Great Potato Famine. In Ireland, they were growing potatoes. That was one of their crops. And England, Great Britain, owned Ireland. And they were supposed to be producing potatoes for England. So they had a blight where the potatoes were rotting on the ground. Now, there would have been enough potatoes for the people in Ireland to survive, but the people in England said, no, you have to send all those over to England, which meant that the poor people in Ireland were starving to death. And about 1 million people died over in Ireland, and about 1.5 million people moved to America because they were starving over there. The second largest group of people coming to America at this time was from Germany. What was the impact? What happened because of it? Well, we had so many people coming here that it drove down wages because factory owners didn't have to pay very much because the immigrants were willing to work for basically very little. And there was a lot of prejudice, which is funny because, all the people except the Native Americans had come from immigration. But there were a lot of people living here that they're called nativist. They're like, oh, only people should have jobs that live here and were born here. And so the immigrants faced a lot of prejudice. They weren't nice to them. And these nativists got together and they started their own party. And they were known as the Know Nothing Party because they were putting out propaganda against immigration. They wanted to limit citizenship. They were afraid that all these new immigrants were going to take their jobs and make the wages lower, so they didn't want the immigrants. And then at the very end, in 1854, this Know Nothing Party became the American Party. It's not around today, so it wasn't there very long. Okay, so anyway, so all you're doing is the guided reading. It's for today and tomorrow, and I'll do a real brief video tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.